Before I begin, if you've ever lived through poverty, judgment, or quiet desperation like this, please leave a comment, and subscribe to Voice of Legends. I didn't mean to text him. That's the part people don't believe when they hear my story. They think it was some clever scheme, some calculated attempt to squeeze money out of a stranger with a sob story. But the truth is uglier and simpler than that. I was exhausted, scared, and counting the last scoops of baby formula in a cracked plastic container at 2 in the morning when my hands were shaking so badly I typed the wrong number. My name is Marissa. At least that's the name I'll use here. I was 28 years old, living in a one-bedroom apartment that smelled faintly of damp carpet and boiled noodles, with my 6-month-old son, Eli, asleep in a crib I found on the curb and cleaned until my knuckles bled. His breathing was soft and uneven, the way babies breathe, like they're not quite convinced they want to stay in the world yet. I watched his chest rise and fall and tried not to cry because crying always woke him up. I'd been a single mom for exactly 6 months and 4 days. I knew because I counted everything back then. Days without sleep, days without help, days since his father walked out with a trash bag full of clothes and the last of our savings because, in his words, I didn't sign up for this kind of life. That night I had 3 scoops of formula left. 3. Anyone who's never had a hungry baby doesn't understand what that number does to your heart. Each scoop isn't just food, it's time, it's an hour of peace. It's the difference between your child sleeping and screaming until his tiny face turns red and his fists shake. I had already sold my hair, pawned my grandmother's necklace, returned cans for deposit until my fingers smelled like rust and soda. My paycheck from the diner wouldn't hit until Friday, and it was Monday night. I had no one left to ask. My mother had passed when I was 19. My father disappeared even earlier than that. Friends drift away when you can never afford coffee and you always smell faintly of spit-up and stress. So I stared at my phone, at a contact I'd saved months ago when I'd been helping a customer at the diner sign into the Wi-Fi. His name was Daniel Harper. He'd been polite, too polite, the kind of man whose clothes didn't wrinkle when he sat down. He tipped generously and smiled like someone who didn't need anything from the world. I had saved his number by accident when he texted himself a confirmation code from my phone. I never deleted it, mostly because I never cleaned anything out anymore. But that wasn't the number I meant to text. I meant to text the local church outreach line. Same area code, same first 3 digits, one wrong tap. My message was short because pride still lived somewhere inside me, bruised but breathing. I typed, "Hi, I'm so sorry to bother you. This is embarrassing. I'm a single mom and I'm out of baby formula. I get paid Friday. I just need $20 to get through the week. I understand if you can't." I stared at it for a long time. Then I hit send before I could stop myself. The message whooshed away and immediately my stomach dropped. I checked the number, my breath caught in my throat. This wasn't the church. This was Daniel Harper, the customer, the man with the pressed suit and quiet eyes. I felt sick. I typed another message immediately. "I'm so sorry, wrong number, please ignore." Then I turned my phone face down on the table and pressed my forehead against the cold surface and whispered, "You're so stupid," over and over like a prayer. Minutes passed. Eli stirred in his crib, made that small, questioning noise babies make before they cry. I mixed 1 scoop of formula with more water than I should have and prayed he wouldn't notice. As he drank, my phone buzzed. I didn't look at it right away. I was afraid of laughter, afraid of judgment, afraid of being told exactly what the world had already been telling me for months, that I should have made better choices, that my desperation was my own fault. When I finally picked up the phone, my hands were numb. The message said, "You don't need to apologize. How old is your baby?" That was it. No lecture, no suspicion, just that question. I sat down hard on the couch. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure Eli could hear it. I typed back, 6 months. Another pause, then, "Is he healthy? Any allergies?" I didn't understand what was happening. People don't ask follow-up questions like that unless they're about to judge you or help you, and no one had helped me in a long time. "He's healthy," I wrote. "No allergies. I really didn't mean to ask you. I'm sorry." This time the reply came faster. "Please don't apologize. Everyone needs help sometimes." Then my phone buzzed again, a notification from my bank app. I hadn't gotten one of those in days. My balance had been sitting at $1.42, mocking me every time I checked. The deposit was for $200. I stared at the screen, convinced it was a mistake. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't get enough air. Then another message came through. "I sent a little extra. Get enough formula so you don't have to worry tonight." I started crying then, not the quiet tears I'd mastered, but the kind that shake your whole body. I covered my mouth so I wouldn't wake Eli. I cried because someone had seen me without asking for proof, because someone had believed me, because for the first time in months, I wasn't counting scoops. I typed a thank you that didn't feel big enough. "I don't know how to repay you." The reply came after a moment. "Just take care of your son. That's repayment enough." I thought that was the end of it. I really did. I went to the 24-hour store the next morning and bought formula like it was treasure. I slept for 3 uninterrupted hours while Eli napped with a full belly. I told myself this was just a kind stranger, a one-time miracle. I didn't know yet that this mistake would open a door I wasn't ready to walk through. I didn't know that kindness can carry weight, and that sometimes help comes wrapped in expectations you don't see until it's too late. All I knew then was that my baby was fed, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like maybe I could breathe again. I thought that would be the end of it, that Daniel Harper would fade back into the category of strangers who briefly intersect your life and disappear. I wanted it to be the end, because hope can be dangerous when you're barely holding things together. But 2 days later, while I was wiping down tables at the diner during the slow mid-afternoon lull, my phone buzzed again. I glanced at it, expecting a spam alert or another overdraft warning. Instead, I saw his name. My chest tightened immediately. The message was simple. "Just checking in. Did you get what you needed?" I stared at the screen longer than necessary. There was no reason for him to check in. He'd already done more than enough. I didn't want to seem ungrateful or worse, like I was lingering for more help. Pride is a strange thing. It doesn't disappear when you're poor. Sometimes it's all you have left. "Yes," I typed back. "Thank you again. I really appreciate it." A few minutes passed, then, "I'm glad. If you don't mind me asking, where do you live?" That question made my stomach knot, not because it was invasive, but because it reminded me of the imbalance between us. He was a man who could send $200 without blinking. I was a woman who flinched at every unexpected question because life had taught me that help often comes with strings. "I'm in Cedar Grove," I replied, keeping it vague. "That's not far from my office," he wrote. "I own a few businesses there." I didn't know what to say to that. I vaguely remembered other servers whispering about him when he came in. Someone had said he was big money. Someone else said he was on the news once. I'd never paid attention. Wealth lives in a different world, and I had learned early on not to stare too hard at things I could never touch. I slipped my phone back into my apron and finished my shift with my mind spinning. When I got home, Eli was fussy, his gums swollen and sore from teething. I rocked him until my arms ached and my thoughts drifted back to Daniel. His messages replayed in my head. They weren't flirtatious, they weren't pitying, they were attentive. That scared me more than anything. That night, after Eli finally fell asleep, my phone buzzed again. I hope this isn't overstepping, but if you ever need help again, you don't have to hesitate. I stared at the words in the dim light of the kitchen. I thought about the eviction notice folded in my drawer, dated for next month. I thought about my car, which made a grinding sound every time I turned the key. I thought about how close I was always to one disaster undoing everything. Thank you, I replied. I'll keep that in mind. Weeks passed. Life didn't magically improve, but it didn't collapse either. I paid rent late, but paid it. I kept my head down at work. I bought generic diapers and watered-down juice. Daniel didn't text every day, sometimes not even every week. When he did, it was brief, a check-in, a question about Eli. Once he sent $100 with a note that said, "For diapers." I cried again, but quieter this time. Then one evening he asked if he could call me. I almost said no. Talking felt too intimate. A voice makes things real in a way text never does. But curiosity and exhaustion got the better of me. I stepped out onto the small balcony, the concrete cold under my bare feet, and answered. His voice was calm, low, measured. It sounded like someone who was used to being listened to. He asked about my day, about Eli, about how I ended up where I was. I didn't tell him everything. I never told anyone everything. But I told him enough. He said, "I grew up poor at one point, surprising me. Not this kind of poor, but enough to remember the fear." I wanted to believe him. I think part of me did. After that, the calls became more frequent. He never asked for anything inappropriate, never crossed a line, but slowly, subtly, my life began to orbit around his presence. He offered to cover a medical bill when Eli had a fever. He arranged for a mechanic he trusted to look at my car for free. Each gesture made things easier and made me more indebted, whether he intended that or not. One afternoon, he asked if I'd ever consider a better job. He said, "I could help you get something more stable. You're clearly capable." That word, capable, hit me harder than any donation. No one had described me that way in a long time. "What kind of job?" I asked cautiously. "Administrative work. One of my companies needs someone reliable, flexible hours." I hesitated. Mixing help with employment felt risky, but so did staying where I was. So I said yes. The office was nothing like the diner. Glass walls, quiet voices, people who didn't yell when they were unhappy. The pay wasn't amazing, but it was steady. Daniel kept his distance there, professional to the point of cold. I told myself that was a good sign. But then came the night everything shifted. He invited me to dinner. "Just to talk," he said. "No pressure." I should have said no. I know that now. But I hadn't been out to dinner since before Eli was born. I wore my one decent dress and left Eli with a neighbor who owed me a favor. The restaurant was expensive, too expensive. I felt out of place immediately. Daniel noticed and smiled gently. "Relax," he said. "You're my guest." We talked for hours about life, about choices, about loneliness. At some point, he looked at me in a way he never had before. Not predatory, not aggressive, but expectant. "I've helped you a lot," he said quietly. "I hope you understand why." My stomach dropped. "Because you're kind?" I offered. He didn't smile this time. "Because I care about you." The silence stretched between us. I realized then that the help hadn't been free after all. It wasn't malicious, but it wasn't innocent either. He hadn't demanded anything, but he had assumed something. I went home that night with my thoughts in chaos, gratitude tangled with fear, relief mixed with regret. I held Eli and wondered how many choices I could afford to make for myself anymore. The next morning, Daniel texted, "Take your time. I don't expect an answer right away." But the question was already there, heavy and unspoken. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake listening to Eli breathe, replaying Daniel's words over and over in my head, searching for angles I might have missed. He hadn't asked me outright for anything. He hadn't touched me, hadn't made threats, hadn't even raised his voice. And yet I felt cornered in a way I couldn't explain without sounding ungrateful. That was the worst part. If I told anyone, they'd say I was lucky. They'd say I should be flattered. They'd say I owed him something. In the morning, I went to work with a knot in my stomach. Daniel wasn't in the office. He never was when I first arrived. I tried to focus on emails, invoices, schedules, but my hands shook every time my phone buzzed. Around noon, I finally got a message. "I hope you're okay today." I stared at it for a long time before replying. "I'm just thinking," I wrote. "I understand," he said. "No rush." But there was a rush. There's always a rush when your stability depends on someone else's goodwill. I started noticing things I hadn't before. How my paycheck came directly from one of his personal accounts. How quickly favors were granted when he intervened. How small I felt signing documents with his company logo at the top. That afternoon, I picked Eli up early from the neighbor's apartment. She smiled at me and said, "You look tired, honey." I laughed weakly. She didn't know how true that was. That night, Daniel called again. I almost didn't answer, but avoidance doesn't pay rent. I stepped into the hallway so Eli wouldn't hear my voice shake. "I don't want you to feel pressured," he said immediately. "I value honesty." I took a deep breath. "I appreciate everything you've done," I said slowly. "More than you know, but I can't be with someone because I feel like I owe them." There was a pause, then a sigh. "I never wanted you to feel that way." "But I do," I said, my voice cracked. "I'm scared that if I say no, everything I've built will disappear." His tone changed then, not angry, controlled. "Marissa, I would never retaliate." I know, and I did know. That's what made it harder. Power doesn't have to threaten to be frightening. It just has to exist. We ended the call politely, but something had shifted. The next week, things at work grew distant, not hostile, just cooler. My requests took longer to be approved. Conversations became strictly professional. The extra help stopped. I told myself this was good. This was what I wanted, independence. But independence is expensive. The car repair Daniel had covered once was no longer free. Eli's daycare raised their rates. My hours at work were cut slightly, justified as budget adjustments. I started skipping meals again, not entirely, just enough to stretch things. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself I was strong. But one night I found myself counting scoops of formula again. That broke me. I sat on the kitchen floor and cried silently, my back against the cabinet, my hands covering my face so Eli wouldn't see me. I wondered if I'd been foolish, if pride was a luxury I couldn't afford, if love was always going to be transactional for someone like me. The next day, Daniel asked to see me in his office. The door closed behind me with a soft click that echoed louder than it should have. "You've been struggling, I've noticed," he said. I swallowed hard. "I'm managing." He leaned back in his chair, studying me. "You don't have to." There it was, the unspoken offer, stability in exchange for closeness, not explicitly said, but hanging between us like a contract written in invisible ink. "I want to succeed on my own," I said quietly. He nodded slowly. "That's admirable, but don't confuse struggle with virtue." I left his office with my head high and my heart in pieces. 2 weeks later, I was laid off. Officially, it was restructuring. Unofficially, we both knew the truth. I packed my desk in silence while coworkers avoided my eyes. No one wants to be associated with someone who falls out of favor. At home, I stared at the eviction notice again, the date circled in red now. I had no backup plan, no savings, no pride left to spend. That night, I got a text from an unknown number. "Hi, this is Clara from the Cedar Grove Community Center. Daniel Harper suggested I reach out. We have a child care and job placement program you might qualify for." I sat very still. My first reaction was anger. My second was confusion. My third was something like relief. Daniel had found another way to help, one that didn't require me to belong to him. I didn't know what it meant. I didn't know what it would cost. But I knew this story wasn't over. I used to think the story ended there. Survival, stability, a quiet, earned sense of peace. But life has a way of testing lessons to see if you truly learned them or if you just memorize the words. Eli was almost 4 when the letter arrived. A thick envelope, cream-colored, with my name typed neatly across the front. No return address I recognized. My first instinct was fear. Fear never really leaves you once it's lived in your bones. I opened it slowly, sitting at the kitchen table while Eli colored dinosaurs beside me. Inside was a formal invitation, a charity gala, the Harper Foundation. My stomach tightened before I even finished reading. At the bottom, in handwriting I recognized immediately, were the words, "I would appreciate it if you came." I folded the letter and set it aside, my heart racing. I hadn't spoken to Daniel in years, not since that grocery store aisle. I had rebuilt my life carefully, deliberately, with boundaries like walls. I didn't want to reopen anything. That night, after Eli was asleep, I read the letter again. The foundation funded childcare programs, job training initiatives, emergency housing grants, the same kinds of services that had helped me when I was at my lowest. My name was listed among a small group of community voices invited to attend. I realized that this wasn't about Daniel wanting to see me. It was about him wanting me to be part of the story he was telling the world. I didn't respond right away. I sat with it for days. I talked it through with a woman from the community center who had become a friend. She listened quietly, then said, "You don't owe him your presence, but you do own your story." That sentence stayed with me. I decided to go. Not for Daniel, for myself, for the woman I had been on that kitchen floor counting scoops of formula, for Eli, who deserved to see his mother stand tall in rooms that once would have swallowed her whole. The night of the gala, I wore a simple navy dress, nothing flashy, nothing apologetic. I walked into the ballroom with my shoulders back and my head high, even though my heart was pounding. Crystal lights glittered overhead. People laughed easily, like money made joy lighter. Daniel spotted me from across the room. Our eyes met. He looked startled. Then something like relief softened his face. He approached slowly, respectfully, as if afraid I might vanish. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I'm here for the work," I replied. He nodded. Of course. Later that evening, after speeches and applause, he took the stage. He spoke about poverty not as an abstract concept, but as a lived reality. He talked about power imbalances, about learning when help becomes control. My chest tightened as I realized he was telling our story without telling it, owning his mistakes without naming them. Then he did something I didn't expect. He invited me to speak. The room fell silent as I walked to the podium. I felt the old fear rise, but I didn't let it win. I told them about being a single mother, about that wrong text, about how help saved my child, but boundaries saved my dignity. I didn't vilify Daniel. I didn't praise him either. I told the truth. When I finished, the applause was slow at first. Then it grew. I stepped down shaking, not from fear this time, but from release. Afterward, Daniel approached me quietly. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" I asked. "For not letting me rewrite history," he replied. We talked briefly, cordially, honestly, then we went our separate ways again. Driving home that night, I felt lighter than I had in years. Closure isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's just being heard without being owned. I tucked Eli in and kissed his forehead. As I turned off the light, I realized something profound. That mistaken text had not just fed my child, it had forced two people to confront the difference between generosity and respect. And that lesson, hard-earned and imperfect, was worth more than any check ever could be. After the gala, something unexpected happened. Not overnight, not in some dramatic montage way, but quietly, the way real change tends to arrive. I started getting emails, messages from women who had been in that room, from men too. Some were donors, some were volunteers, some were single parents who had heard my speech through a clip posted online and recognized themselves in my words. They weren't asking me for money, they were asking me for perspective. One woman wrote, "I've always wanted to help, but I'm afraid of doing it wrong." Another said, "I grew up poor and became wealthy. I don't know how to bridge that gap without guilt or control." I read every message slowly, carefully. I realized that my story wasn't just about survival anymore. It had become a mirror for people on both sides of need. Clara from the community center asked if I'd consider joining their advisory board. "You understand the system from the inside," she said, "and you know where it breaks." I said yes. Balancing work, motherhood, and advocacy wasn't easy. Some nights I fell asleep with my laptop still open, Eli's homework spread across the table. But I felt purposeful in a way I hadn't before. Not grateful in a forced way, not indebted, just rooted. Daniel and I didn't speak often, but when we did, it was different. He asked before offering. He listened more than he talked. Once, during a meeting, someone suggested naming a program after him. He shook his head and said, "Name it after the people it serves." I caught his eye across the table and we shared a brief, understanding look. People assume growth erases the past. It doesn't. It just puts it in context. I still remembered the fear, the hunger, the humiliation of asking for help. Those memories didn't disappear, but they no longer controlled me. They informed me. Eli grew into a thoughtful, curious boy. One afternoon, he came home from school and said, "Mom, my teacher asked what my hero looks like." I smiled. "What did you say?" He replied, "I said heroes look tired but don't quit." I had to step into the bathroom so he wouldn't see me cry. Years ago, one wrong text connected me to a billionaire, but the real transformation didn't come from his money. It came from learning that my voice had value even when my bank account didn't. From understanding that dignity isn't something someone gives you, it's something you protect, even when it costs you. If you're listening to this and you're in that dark place right now, counting scoops, counting days, counting how much you can endure, please hear me. Help is not shameful, but your boundaries matter. Your story matters, and even mistakes can become beginnings if you refuse to disappear inside them. That text was an accident. Becoming whole was not. There's a strange moment that happens when your life finally steadies. Not joy exactly, more like silence. The kind where you're no longer in crisis, but you're not yet sure who you are without it. That was where I found myself a year after the gala. I wasn't struggling the way I used to. Bills were paid on time, the fridge was full. Eli had opinions now, strong ones, about what he wore and what he ate. But sometimes, late at night, I'd sit alone and feel an ache I couldn't name. Survival had given me purpose for so long that peace felt unfamiliar, almost suspicious. That's when I got the call. It was from a woman named Renee, a journalist working on a long-form piece about modern philanthropy and power dynamics. She said she'd heard my speech. She wanted to interview me. At first, I said no. I had learned that exposure can be another kind of currency, and not always a kind one. But she wasn't asking for a headline. She was asking for nuance. We met at a quiet cafe. I told her everything I hadn't said on stage, about the fear of losing my job, about the guilt that crept in when help was withdrawn, about how easy it is to confuse kindness with obligation when your child's needs are on the line. She listened without interrupting. When the article came out, it didn't go viral, and I was grateful for that. But it traveled quietly through the right circles, nonprofits, foundations, policy groups, people who had influence but rarely heard from the people affected by their decisions. Soon after, I was invited to speak, not at galas, but in rooms with folding chairs and stale coffee where budgets were debated line by line. I talked about dignity, about consent in help, about how poverty strips you of choices long before it strips you of money. Not everyone liked what I said. One man told me I sounded ungrateful. I smiled and said, gratitude doesn't require silence. At home, Eli watched me practice speeches from the hallway. One day he asked, "Mom, why do you tell people hard things?" I knelt in front of him, because hard things don't change until someone says them out loud. Daniel and I crossed paths occasionally at events. Our conversations were brief, respectful. Once he told me, "You changed how I see giving." I shook my head. No, I just refused to disappear. The truth was, we had both been changed, but in different ways, for different reasons. One night, after putting Eli to bed, I found the old phone in a drawer, the one I'd used back then. I turned it on out of curiosity. There it was, the text thread, the wrong number, the message that started everything. I didn't feel shame anymore. I didn't feel regret. I felt compassion for the woman I had been and for the one I had become. Some mistakes don't need to be erased. They need to be understood. And some stories aren't about being saved. They're about learning how to stand, even when help is offered from above. Time has a way of rearranging your memories. The sharp edges dull, the panic softens into something almost tender. But every once in a while, life puts you back in a moment just to see if you still remember who you are. Eli was 7 when it happened, old enough to notice things, old enough to ask questions I couldn't dodge with half answers anymore. His school was hosting a careers and community day, and parents were invited to speak. I hesitated when the flyer came home in his backpack. I wasn't a doctor or a firefighter or anything that fit neatly into a child's idea of success. Eli changed that. "You should come," he said matter-of-factly. "You help people." So I went. I stood in front of a room of restless children and talked about listening, about paying attention to people who are struggling, about how everyone needs help sometimes and how asking for it doesn't make you weak. I kept it simple, honest. Afterward, a little girl with uneven pigtails raised her hand and asked, "What if you asked the wrong person?" The room went quiet. I felt something settle in my chest. "Then you learn something," I said gently, "and sometimes even the wrong person teaches you the right lesson." That night, Eli asked me again about being poor. This time he wanted details. I told him what was appropriate, about budgeting, about choices, about mistakes. I didn't tell him everything. Children don't need the full weight of their parents' pain. But I told him enough so he'd understand resilience isn't magic, it's practice. Later that week, I received another message. This one surprised me. It was from Daniel. He asked if I'd consider helping design a new program, one that would place strict boundaries between donors and recipients. Anonymous aid, no personal access, no leverage. "I don't want to repeat old patterns," he wrote. I sat with that for a long time. People can change, but not all of them do the work. Daniel had, slowly, imperfectly, publicly and privately. I agreed, but on my terms, clear roles, written safeguards, accountability that didn't rely on trust alone. Working on that program was strange, healing, but also sobering.
Every safeguard we put in place came from a story like mine, or worse, stories where the cost of help had been far higher than pride. At the launch, Daniel stayed in the background. He let others speak. That mattered. A reporter asked me later if I felt vindicated. I shook my head. "This isn't about winning," I said. "It's about not repeating harm." That night, as I drove home, I realized something quietly powerful. My life was no longer defined by that wrong text, but it wasn't erased either. It had become part of a larger story, one about growth, about responsibility, about the difference between saving someone and standing beside them. I tucked Eli in and watched him sleep for a moment longer than usual. His room was warm, safe, full of things chosen, not scavenged. I thought about how close I'd come to a different future, one shaped by obligation instead of choice. If there is a moral to all this, it's not that kindness is dangerous, it's that kindness without awareness can become control, and that the bravest thing a person in need can do is say, "This far and no further." I turned off the light and went to bed knowing this wasn't just my story anymore. It belonged to every person who had ever swallowed their pride to survive, and then slowly learned how to stand back up.
By the time Eli turned 9, I had learned something I never expected to learn back in those early days of survival. Stability has its own kind of fear. When you've lived long enough on the edge, part of you is always waiting for the floor to drop out again. Even when everything is fine, you listen for cracks. I was packing Eli's lunch one morning when he said, "Mom, why do you always double-check things?" I paused, peanut butter knife hovering in midair. "What do you mean?" "You check the door twice. You check the stove twice. You check the calendar a lot." He shrugged. "I just noticed." I smiled softly. Children notice more than we think. "Because once I couldn't afford mistakes," I said, "and habits stick." That afternoon, I attended a meeting at the community center. A new group of parents had joined the program. Nervous faces, tight smiles, the same posture I used to have, like the world might take something from you if you relaxed too much. I introduced myself simply, not as a speaker, not as a board member, just as someone who'd been there. One woman stayed behind afterward. She held her phone tightly in her hand, eyes darting toward the door. "Can I ask you something?" she whispered. "Of course," I said. She showed me a text thread, a donor, a benefactor, someone offering help but asking for access, time, attention, gratitude that felt heavier than it should. My chest tightened as I read her words. I saw myself in every line. "What do I do?" she asked. "If I say no, I lose everything." I took a slow breath. "You don't lose everything," I said carefully. "You lose one source, and sometimes that opens the door to safer ones." She cried, quietly. I sat with her until the room emptied. I didn't give her a solution. I gave her clarity and contact numbers, and the one thing no one had given me back then, permission to choose herself. That night, driving home, I thought about how easily power hides inside generosity, how many people never realize the imbalance until they feel it pressing on their chest. I also thought about how responsibility grows when you survive something others are still living through. Daniel and I spoke once more that year, briefly. He told me the anonymous aid program was expanding, that other foundations were adopting similar models. "It's not perfect," he said. "It never is," I replied, "but it's better." After the call, I didn't feel closure, I felt continuity. Stories don't always end, some just widen. Eli joined a soccer team. I sat on the sidelines with other parents, cheering, laughing, blending in. Ordinary. Once that would have felt impossible. Now it felt earned. On the drive home from one game, Eli said, "Mom, you help a lot of people." I glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "So do you." "How?" I said, "You notice, and you're kind without expecting anything back." He thought about that, then smiled. That night, after he fell asleep, I stood in the doorway of his room and remembered the woman I used to be. The one counting scoops, the one sending a text she never meant to send. I wished I could tell her, "This will not always feel this small. You will not always be this afraid. And the help that truly matters won't ask you to shrink to receive it." The wrong text changed my life, but choosing myself, that's what defined it. By the time Eli turned 9, I had learned something I never expected to learn back in those early days of survival. Stability has its own kind of fear. When you've lived long enough on the edge, part of you is always waiting for the floor to drop out again. Even when everything is fine, you listen for cracks. I was packing Eli's lunch one morning when he said, "Mom, why do you always double-check things?" I paused, peanut butter knife hovering in midair. "What do you mean?" "You check the door twice, you check the stove twice, you check the calendar a lot." He shrugged. "I just noticed." I smiled softly. Children notice more than we think. "Because once I couldn't afford mistakes," I said, "and habits stick." That afternoon, I attended a meeting at the community center. A new group of parents had joined the program. Nervous faces, tight smiles, the same posture I used to have, like the world might take something from you if you relaxed too much. I introduced myself simply, not as a speaker, not as a board member, just as someone who had been there. One woman stayed behind afterward. She held her phone tightly in her hand, eyes darting toward the door. "Can I ask you something?" she whispered. "Of course," I said. She showed me a text thread, a donor, a benefactor, someone offering help but asking for access, time, attention, gratitude that felt heavier than it should. My chest tightened as I read her words. I saw myself in every line. "What do I do?" she asked. "If I say no, I lose everything." I took a slow breath. "You don't lose everything," I said carefully. "You lose one source, and sometimes that opens the door to safer ones." She cried, quietly. I sat with her until the room emptied. I didn't give her a solution. I gave her clarity and contact numbers, and the one thing no one had given me back then, permission to choose herself. That night, driving home, I thought about how easily power hides inside generosity, how many people never realize the imbalance until they feel it pressing on their chest. I also thought about how responsibility grows when you survive something others are still living through. Daniel and I spoke once more that year, briefly. He told me the anonymous aid program was expanding, that other foundations were adopting similar models. "It's not perfect," he said. "It never is," I replied, "but it's better." After the call, I didn't feel closure. I felt continuity. Stories don't always end. Some just widen. Eli joined a soccer team. I sat on the sidelines with other parents, cheering, laughing, blending in. Ordinary. Once that would have felt impossible. Now it felt earned. On the drive home from one game, Eli said, "Mom, you help a lot of people." I glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "So do you." "How?" I said, "You notice, and you're kind without expecting anything back." He thought about that, then smiled. That night, after he fell asleep, I stood in the doorway of his room and remembered the woman I used to be, the one counting scoops, the one sending a text she never meant to send. I wished I could tell her this: "You will not always feel this small. You will not always be this afraid. And the help that truly matters won't ask you to shrink to receive it." The wrong text changed my life, but choosing myself, that's what defined it. By the time Eli turned 9, I had learned something I never expected to learn back in those early days of survival. Stability has its own kind of fear. When you've lived long enough on the edge, part of you is always waiting for the floor to drop out again. Even when everything is fine, you listen for cracks. I was packing Eli's lunch one morning when he said, "Mom, why do you always double-check things?" I paused, peanut butter knife hovering in midair. "What do you mean?" "You check the door twice, you check the stove twice, you check the calendar a lot." He shrugged. "I just noticed." I smiled softly. Children notice more than we think. "Because once I couldn't afford mistakes," I said, "and habits stick." That afternoon, I attended a meeting at the community center. A new group of parents had joined the program. Nervous faces, tight smiles, the same posture I used to have, like the world might take something from you if you relaxed too much. I introduced myself simply, not as a speaker, not as a board member, just as someone who had been there. One woman stayed behind afterward. She held her phone tightly in her hand, eyes darting toward the door. "Can I ask you something?" she whispered. "Of course," I said. She showed me a text thread, a donor, a benefactor, someone offering help but asking for access, time, attention, gratitude that felt heavier than it should. My chest tightened as I read her words. I saw myself in every line. "What do I do?" she asked. "If I say no, I lose everything." I took a slow breath. "You don't lose everything," I said carefully. "You lose one source, and sometimes that opens the door to safer ones." She cried, quietly. I sat with her until the room emptied. I didn't give her a solution. I gave her clarity and contact numbers, and the one thing no one had given me back then, permission to choose herself. That night, driving home, I thought about how easily power hides inside generosity, how many people never realize the imbalance until they feel it pressing on their chest. I also thought about how responsibility grows when you survive something others are still living through. Daniel and I spoke once more that year, briefly. He told me the anonymous aid program was expanding, that other foundations were adopting similar models. "It's not perfect," he said. "It never is," I replied, "but it's better." After the call, I didn't feel closure. I felt continuity. Stories don't always end. Some just widen. Eli joined a soccer team. I sat on the sidelines with other parents, cheering, laughing, blending in. Ordinary. Once that would have felt impossible. Now it felt earned. On the drive home from one game, Eli said, "Mom, you help a lot of people." I glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "So do you." "How?" I said, "You notice, and you're kind without expecting anything back." He thought about that, then smiled. That night, after he fell asleep, I stood in the doorway of his room and remembered the woman I used to be, the one counting scoops, the one sending a text she never meant to send. I wished I could tell her this: you will not always feel this small. You will not always be this afraid. And the help that truly matters won't ask you to shrink to receive it. The wrong text changed my life, but choosing myself, that's what defined it. The last time I thought about that text, the one that started everything, I was cleaning out an old email folder late at night. Eli was asleep, the house quiet in that settled way it only gets when you're no longer bracing for disaster. I found a scanned copy of a bank statement from years ago, the one that showed the $200 deposit. For a moment, I just stared at it. I didn't feel gratitude. I didn't feel anger. I felt distance, and that's how I knew I had healed. I closed the file and shut the laptop, letting the silence sit. Healing doesn't announce itself. It shows up when memories no longer control your breathing, when the past can be held without shaking. Eli is almost 12 now. He's thoughtful, stubborn, curious about the world in a way that makes me hopeful. He knows our story in broad strokes. He knows we struggled. He knows people helped us. What he doesn't know, and doesn't need to know yet, is how close I came to losing myself while trying to keep him safe. One day, when he's older, I may tell him the full truth. Not to burden him, but to teach him discernment, to teach him that generosity and power aren't the same thing, that love never asks you to shrink, that dignity is not something you earn, it's something you defend. Every so often, I still receive messages from people who've heard my story. Some are in crisis, some are donors trying to do better, some just want reassurance that mistakes don't have to define you forever. I answer when I can, not as an expert, as a witness. If there's one thing I want you to take from my story, it's this. Desperation can put you in places you never planned to be. It can make you accept things you never thought you would. But it does not erase your right to choose who you become afterward. I was a poor single mother who sent a text to the wrong number. That's how the story begins. But it's not how it ends. It ends with a child who feels safe, with a woman who trusts herself again, with a life built slowly, deliberately, without fear hanging over every decision. And if you're listening to this right now, wondering how one mistake, one moment, one wrong turn could ever lead somewhere better, let me tell you gently and honestly, it can. Not because someone rescues you, but because you refuse to disappear inside the help you're given. That's what happened next. Before I begin, if you've ever lived through poverty, judgment, or quiet desperation like this, please like, leave a comment, and subscribe to Voice of Legends. I didn't mean to text him. That's the part people don't believe when they hear my story. They think it was planned, calculated, some kind of scheme. But the truth is, I was exhausted, scared, and sitting on the kitchen floor at 2 a.m, counting scoops of baby formula like they were gold coins. My hands were shaking, my eyes burned from crying I didn't let myself finish, and I typed the wrong number. My name is Marissa. I was 28 years old, a single mother living in a one-bedroom apartment with peeling paint, a leaking sink, and a crib I rescued from the curb and scrubbed clean with bleach until my hands cracked. My son, Eli, was 6 months old. He slept lightly, like he didn't fully trust the world yet. I watched his chest rise and fall, afraid every breath might be the one where I failed him. His father left when I was 3 months pregnant, not dramatically, not cruelly, just quietly, with a trash bag of clothes and the words, "I can't do this." I learned early that abandonment doesn't always come with shouting. Sometimes it comes softly, like a door closing you don't notice until the room is cold. That night, I had 3 scoops of formula left. 3. Anyone who has never had a hungry baby doesn't understand what that number does to your soul. Each scoop is time. Each scoop is peace. Each scoop is survival. I had already sold my hair, pawned my grandmother's necklace, returned cans until my fingers smelled like rust. My paycheck from the diner wouldn't come until Friday. It was Monday. I had no one left to ask. So I opened my phone and typed a message meant for a local church outreach line. Same area code, same first 3 digits, one wrong tap. "Hi, I'm so sorry to bother you. This is embarrassing. I'm a single mom and I'm out of baby formula. I get paid Friday. I just need $20 to get through the week. I understand if you can't." I stared at it for a long time. Then I hit send. Immediately, my stomach dropped. I checked the number. It wasn't the church. It was Daniel Harper. I knew him only as a customer from the diner, polite, well-dressed, the kind of man whose clothes didn't wrinkle when he sat down. Someone had whispered once that he was big money. I had never paid attention. Wealth lives in a different universe, and I'd learned not to stare.
I panicked and sent another text. "I'm so sorry, wrong number, please ignore." Then I put my phone face down and whispered, "You're so stupid," into the silence. Minutes passed. Eli stirred. I mixed 1 scoop of formula with more water than I should have and prayed he wouldn't notice. Then my phone buzzed. "You don't need to apologize," the message said. "How old is your baby?" I sat down hard on the couch. My heart pounded so loud I was sure Eli could hear it. 6 months, I typed. Another pause, then, "Is he healthy? Any allergies?" No judgment, no lecture. "He's healthy," I replied. "I really didn't mean to ask you." "Everyone needs help sometimes," he wrote. Then my phone buzzed again. A bank notification. $200 deposited. I stared at the screen, unable to breathe. Another message followed. "I sent a little extra. Get enough formula so you don't have to worry tonight." I cried then, the kind of crying that shakes your whole body, not because of the money, but because someone had seen me without asking for proof. I thought that was the end. It wasn't. Over the next weeks, Daniel checked in occasionally, never demanding, never rude. He helped with diapers, a doctor bill, a car repair. He offered me a job, stable hours, better pay. I accepted because survival doesn't allow luxury skepticism. But help changes shape when power enters the room. Slowly, subtly, I realized how much of my stability rested in his hands. When he invited me to dinner, when he said he cared about me, I understood the unspoken expectation. He never demanded anything. That's what made it worse. I told him I couldn't be with someone because I felt like I owed them. I told him I was scared. He said I would never retaliate. I believed him, and still the help stopped. The distance grew. My job disappeared under the word restructuring. I found myself counting scoops again. This time, help came differently, through a community center, through programs, through systems instead of individuals. It wasn't fast, it wasn't glamorous, but it was clean. Years passed. I rebuilt my life piece by piece. Eli grew. I found my voice. I learned that dignity isn't something someone gives you, it's something you protect. I spoke. I advocated. I refused to disappear. Daniel changed too. Not perfectly, but intentionally. He listened. He stepped back. He learned. The wrong text saved my child in the moment. Walking away saved my future. Today, Eli is older, safe, curious, kind. He doesn't remember hunger. That's the greatest gift I ever gave him. And if you're listening to this, counting scoops, counting days, counting how much you can endure, hear me clearly. Needing help does not mean you owe your life. Kindness should lift you up, not make you smaller. And even mistakes can become beginnings. That's what happened next.